Okay, everybody, welcome back. I'd like to introduce Virginia Madden. She drove an hour and a half to be here from the faraway land of Northern Virginia, and she is going to talk to us about recovering from traumatic events, correct?
And just general hardship.
General hardship. We may have experienced that before, so please give your attention to Virginia, and she'll be here for questions at the end. Thank you very much.
I think I have a very long week, probably tired, so I'm going to try to keep this going along. I have some handouts. If you want to grab one, they're mostly at the front. I didn't print enough for everyone, so if you're not into paper, just take a picture so you can follow along. I have a story for every point we go through. We're going to go a little deeper into these points, and hopefully it'll be interesting. A little background on myself. I've been working as a therapist for about 9 years. I really like working with teens and young adults, so I was very excited to have this opportunity. And I'm going to share with you a few things that I wish had been shared with me as a young adult, and I hope that you can at least get one helpful thing from this. So this talk has been about maybe 12, 13 years in the making. When I was in college, I took a class on people who were imprisoned unjustly during World War II in concentration camps or in the Soviet Union's prison camps, the gulags. And it was very interesting to notice how some people just crumbled in these terrible prison conditions. They almost seemed to lose their humanity. They were focused on themselves. They were trying to get enough for them to eat. They didn't care about other people. If they survived, they were broken by the experience. They turned inward, they became more selfish. They had wounds that never healed. And there were other people, say Maximilian Kolbe is a good example, of people who rose above their circumstances. They were able to actually become more human in some ways. They were looking out for others, and they were able to find meaning even in these horrific conditions. And this was before I went to school for counseling, but I was wondering, why do some people have such different reactions to these horrific conditions that frankly probably none of us can really comprehend? We've been very blessed. So I went on my little journey. I got my degree, I started working, and I pulled together about 8 things that I've noticed my clients who overcome and heal from adversity do, and hopefully you can take those with you. So before we get into all the points, I want to share with you, there's this concept called post-traumatic growth. You can look it up if you want. It's people who actually have positive psychological changes after traumatic or difficult experiences. And it's when they have wounds, maybe they are even broken, and the wounds heal. So we're going to be also focused on that. How can you experience that after these events? So the first point, focus on relationships. I know that sounds simplistic, but the people who went into these horrible conditions, it can be imprisonment, it can be other things, they were focused on other people around them. They had a buddy system. Many people who survived were saying, I'm going to help this person, they're going to help me, I'm going to share my food. They actually rose above their circumstances, whereas, as I said, other people were turning inward. Another thing that we can do in our everyday lives when we experience adversity is we can also lean on other people. So I have 2 families that I'm friends with, and they both lost their children in very tragic situations. And it was terrible, but what they did was they didn't turn inward. They accepted our help. We had meal trains. They did not grieve. They had some private grief, but they were actually sharing with us as they were going through it. And I think a lot of people feel like when they're going through something, they have to keep to themselves. And that's actually not helpful for resolving grief. And what people don't understand is when you're letting others into your grief, it actually helps us, because we all wanted to help. We wanted to do something for them. So keep that in mind as well. If you're going through something tough, sharing that with others and allowing others to help, it can actually help them. Something else is, just to touch on this, there is a difference between oversharing and appropriate sharing. Some people will say, oh, Virginia, my therapist told me to go out and tell everyone about what I'm experiencing, and that can backfire. So there's a difference between accepting help and then sharing what is happening with those that you trust. So just a word to the wise there. Relationships with God is also important. We're going to talk more about that. But we heal in relationships, and when you read about people who are not only imprisoned, but they're put in solitary confinement, the only relationship they had was with God at that point. They can't communicate with people. So that is something else to keep in mind. You might be in a situation, hopefully not solitary confinement, where there's no one else, but you do have someone else, and so you can nurture that, and that can help you rise above it. So just moving right along here, the second point I have, this is probably the most important part of the talk, so maybe pay attention and then zone out after. People talk a lot about forgiveness. You know, you have to forgive, and that is really misunderstood. And I'm going to share a story about this to sort of help illustrate my point. So I had a client who, she came to me and she said, she was telling me all about her family. You know, she loved her mom and everything was great and they're best friends. But for some reason, she kept having these huge fights with her mom. And eventually I said, it sounds like you're pretty mad at your mom. And we sort of talked through it, and more stuff came out. And she had all of her moms had problems. This mom had a lot of problems. There were a lot of reasons for her to be very angry at her mother. But she felt she couldn't feel angry because that wasn't the Christian thing to do. And so we talked about how it's actually good to feel angry. And actually, you can't forgive someone for wronging you unless you acknowledge that they have wronged you. So we sort of worked through this over months, where she acknowledged that her mother had done some objectively unjust things, worked through the anger, and she got stuck then. She was stuck for about a year, just angry at her mom. And it wasn't until she decided, you know, I want to forgive. And then she decided to intellectually to make that forgiveness decision. And by the way, forgiveness is not letting someone off the hook. It's not saying, oh, they didn't do it, it wasn't that bad what they did. It's saying, I release you from I don't need an apology from you. I don't need you to make up to me what you did. I'm just gonna release you from that. And that is a process. A lot of people feel really guilty because they go, I wanna forgive, I don't feel that way. Yeah, it's gonna take a while. It happens intellectually, then it happens emotionally. And what happened with this client is when she finally worked through the acknowledgement, the anger, the intellectual decision to forgive, and then she began to feel this emotional weight lifted off of her, and she was actually able to make some progress in her therapy. So just a few points that I have on the handout too. Your feelings are not sins. God got angry when there were money changers in the temple. Jesus flipped over tables. It was unjust, it was wrong, so he was angry. You can be angry if someone has been unjust to you. In fact, some people will say, oh no, you can only be angry if people are bad to God. If someone's bad to you, you can't be angry at them. That's not true, because God is angry at them too for being unkind to you. God made you in his image and likeness, and he wants you to be treated in a charitable, just way. So that is okay to be angry. You should be angry. Forgiveness is also a process, so be patient with yourself. And forgiveness typically happens intellectually before it happens emotionally. I'm going kind of fast, so I actually want to pause here and see if there's any questions or comments so far. And you're allowed to argue with me if you disagree. Anything so far? Oh, yeah.
Is there a time when you don't get the feeling, like you just never?
That also happens. Sometimes you can just say, I want to forgive, I'm making the intellectual decision to forgive. God knows that I want to have that emotional feeling, but we're human, and sometimes we can have a feeling about something, a belief about something, but our feelings don't follow. Yeah. I think you had a question too. Oh,
No.
Maybe not. Okay, sorry. Okay, so forgiveness is a process. You need to do it to heal fully. Okay, this is probably the second most important part of the talk, but there's this idea called dialectical thinking, and most people cannot do it, but it's pretty much 50% of the time what needs to happen for breakthroughs in therapy with my clients, in my experience. So I'm going to use a story to kind of illustrate what dialectical thinking is. So if you go through a breakup, there are generally two camps of friends. There's one camp of friends who goes, good riddance, now you know, you can move on, don't be sad about it. As we know, that may not be very helpful because actually we are sad about it. Perhaps we gave our heart to this person and they crushed it, or we were very disappointed. So there's another kind of friends that goes, oh, you're so sad, take all the time you need. And that's really helpful for a while. At a certain point though, you don't want to just sit in your feelings all the time. So with dialectical thinking, there's kind of the thinking part, where maybe you're thinking, okay, this was the right decision to get out of this relationship, or there's nothing I can do about this relationship. And then there's a feeling part where you're really sad. So what I will often tell clients is to remind themselves, it's understandable that I feel this way, and I know I will heal. I know I will feel better. I know that I will be less miserable in the future. And it can be really hard to hold those two things at once. People like to focus on the thinking part, or the feeling part. Another good one, which I have to work through with a lot of young adults, is I can be angry at someone I love. Those two thoughts seem very contradictory. How can I be angry at someone that I love? And you can. And that's part of working through stuff often. Another example of dialectical thinking is everyone has good qualities and bad qualities. Sometimes we tend to think only the good and only the bad. I gave the breakup example. I'm trying to think if there's another example that I can use to show how dialectical thinking can help people heal. I guess we can go back to the forgiveness part. I can be angry at someone, and I can also be working on forgiving them. So two things that might seem the opposite are actually true at the same time. Okay, any questions about that, or should I keep going? All right. This is another, probably the third most important part. Notice and challenge your beliefs about yourself. So I had a young man who came to see me for therapy, and he had parents who loved him. They really tried. They didn't really get him. So he was constantly making mistakes, and they were constantly saying, no, you're doing it the wrong way. Do it this way. How can you keep making these mistakes? They would be so impatient with him. And so he becomes this young adult, and he thinks, he has this deep belief that I'm incompetent. Whatever I do, I'm going to make a mistake. Why even try? And he also had this other core belief of I'm unworthy. Even when he did well, he would feel like somehow he didn't deserve it. Somehow he had still made a mistake. And that kind of went back to his parents always focusing on, well, you could do this better, you could do that better. He could never be happy with himself. And then the third one was the trickiest one. He just felt he wasn't very lovable. Literally a woman agreed to marry him and said that she loved him. And he still didn't quite believe that he was lovable. And we had to work through this, and he actually felt really dumb for having these beliefs. He goes, I know these aren't true, but I feel them so deeply. What's going on here? And so we had to talk about how his experiences as a child, they actually affected how he felt about himself. And he could know that what he felt was rationally untrue, but it still felt so true. And he had to start talking back to it and saying, this is my traumatic experience that has changed my thinking. And identify that. It's really imperative that you notice any kind of thinking like this, because if you're constantly suppressing like the client I told you about before, you're never going to notice these thinking patterns, and you're never going to be able to address them in your life, and you're never going to be able to change the behaviors that the thinking is changing. So this guy had a road ahead. I'm not sure what happened, but I think he was doing better when we split ways, because he was able to talk back to these thoughts and identify them as untrue. Unfortunately, a lot of people get stuck in them. They just sort of say, oh, I had these thoughts must be true. And then how can you heal from your experiences when you think that way? Okay, any questions about that, or should I keep going? Yeah.
What if you don't know what it connected to in your childhood? There's a connection there that's making you feel unlovable or whatever.
So you're saying somebody might suspect, but they're not quite sure?
Those negative thoughts are there, but they don't know where they're coming
from. So I'm really glad you brought this up. It may not come from your childhood. It might come from something else. It might be there is an aspect of nature here. Some people are naturally harder on themselves. I will say there's always a reason. One thing I I have learned is when you think about it and talk about it and have enough experiences, it kind of comes out. You figure out what's going on. You don't always have to know where it came from though. You can just know that it's not helpful or not true. Yeah, any other questions? Yeah.
How can you feel something but also think it's not true?
Isn't that crazy? But it happens to a lot of people. I'll have people who will say, and I felt this way too, and you probably will at some point, where you go, I'm really, oh, actually here's a good one, public speaking. I used to be so scared of public speaking. Is anyone, am I in danger of my life public speaking? No. So why am I hyperventilating? Why are my palms sweating? We feel so scared, even though we know there's no threat. So it happens, especially when people have gone through tough situations.
How do you feel from constant rejection?
Constant. That's a really hard one. So we're talking about adversity in the present, not just in the future. Sorry, not just in the past, rather. Yeah. So it would be important to. There's two things that are coming to mind. One is identifying what is your behavior and what is others' behavior. So sometimes there might be certain behaviors that are giving people the wrong impression, so you have to figure out what you can control. And there are other things where people are being rejected by people who maybe the rejectors have their own issues as well. So it's important to figure out what's going on with that. The other thing is being around people who don't reject you. I mean, that's so important, as you know. Yeah, having those healthy relationships. Any other follow-ups? Yeah.
So it's kind of a different way of thinking. Instead of being like negative towards yourself, it's protective. What's the difference of that? Like hypervigilance, where you're constantly feeling like there is a threat.
Mm-hmm.
Like you said, public speaking, kind of like that.
Yeah.
But how does that relate to is that a relation to the having like the negative thoughts and whatnot?
Sometimes. So if I came up here and I said, I'm going to absolutely bomb and my presentation is going to be terrible, it probably would be terrible. So sometimes the thinking can affect the actions. And there was another point you made. I'm sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought there.
Like hypervigilance, where you always feel like there's some sort of threat, you always feel some level of anxiety.
Yeah. So there can be so many factors there. Sometimes someone's actually in an objectively stressful environment and they feel something is wrong with them, and I'll say, no, there's actually objective stressors in your environment. It's your environment that's the problem. Other times it's the person might believe they can't handle the environment, so they feel stressed out by it, or they feel that incompetence or that unworthiness or unlovableness. So it's kind of a both and often. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Okay. I don't know if I'm explaining it correctly. Any other follow-ups?
I don't think so.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. So I specifically put the most complicated concepts at the beginning. So let's just coast until the end now. So acceptance is an interesting thing, is people will often think, oh, I have to change my situation. And don't get me wrong, sometimes there are certain behaviors you could do to change your situation, and you should do them if they're healthy, good choices. But suffering is a part of life, and I've had multiple clients. There's one client I'm thinking about in particular who probably for a couple years was just focused on all the things that went wrong, all the ways he had been wronged, and he really had been wronged very terribly. And recently, he said, am I just talking in circles? And I was like, yeah, we have to accept this is what's happening in your life, and it's so unfair. And there's nothing we can do to change it at this point. We can't change the past. So he was actually adding suffering on top of suffering by not being able to accept this was where he's at. And I'm not saying venting is wrong. If your friend comes to you and vents, or if you need to vent, or if you have a hard time accepting, that's totally normal. You're human. We're in relationships with other people. We should be supporting each other. At a certain point, we have to kind of accept what's happening in our life. And after we accept that, then we can say, what can I do, if anything, to improve my situation? I had another client, same thing. You had a stalemate for a year, and then when she just accepted, this is my life, it's tough, she was able to kind of let go and keep going. So strategic practice of acceptance, very, very helpful. I'm gonna go to the next one and then I'll pause for questions. The next part is gratitude. Now, have any of you read A Hiding Place? Yeah, it's a great book. And this is a kind of along the same lines of people unjustly imprisoned in horrific conditions. So Corrie ten Boom and her sister Betsy, I think, they were in a concentration camp.
I know this story.
Yeah, it's pretty great. And her sister Betsy said, we can always find something to be grateful for. And Corey was like, are you kidding me? This is terrible. What can you be grateful for here? And they would have these prayer meetings with the other prisoners in the barracks. They were always worried about the guards breaking it up. And turns out the guards didn't want to go into their barracks because they didn't want to get fleas. And there were a lot of fleas. They were jumping all around. And so the guards didn't go in. They just let them have their prayer meeting. And then Betsy said, see, we can be grateful for the fleas. I am thankful for the fleas. She actually did that because that protected their meetings. So that takes probably very significant holiness. I'm not sure if most of us are at the point where we could be grateful for that, but it is very inspiring. There's always something we can find. Viktor Frankl, who is also a prisoner, he wrote a really great book, Man's Search for Meaning. I recommend that highly. Yeah, he practiced gratitude for little things, like a beautiful sunset when they're walking back to the barracks, or one time I think he got potato or vegetables in his soup, and he was thankful for that. You know, just the little things. I know, I'm sure many of you have done mission work. I know when I went to Kolkata, I helped the missionaries of charity for a month, and they really need help actually. I would see just hordes of street children running around. I would go, whoa, you know, I'm thankful I was not a street child. I mean, there's just so much we can be grateful for, and that doesn't take away our pain or suffering, but it can help us keep going. Okay, any questions so far or thoughts? Yeah.
For going back to the acceptance.
Yeah.
When you reach that point where you're accepting like the situation you're in, how do you make sure that you turn that into growth and not like giving up because you realize
That's a really good point. Yeah. So there's a difference between acceptance and victim. So some people will say, there's no hope, I give up. And you're right, that's not helpful at all. And the people who made it through terrible conditions, they weren't thinking that way. They were thinking, I can't change the situation, I'm literally imprisoned. I've been broken up with, my parents are divorced. I can't do anything about this. What can I do? And you might not be able to do anything. That's actually the hardest thing ever, when there's nothing you can do except pray. I guess that is something. When I would say go back to the focus on relationships part, because it's really helpful to talk it through with someone. What can I actually do about this situation? Not with everyone, talk about it with your trusted friends or family. You can notice any negative beliefs you might be having that are stopping you from making changes. I've had so many clients say, why would I try to wake up early, exercise, eat healthy? I just can't do it anyway. And I go, well, if that's the way you're thinking, you can't, you know? Yeah, so I'm just kind of babbling here. Does that help, or do you have any other follow-ups? Okay, all right, I'll just keep going then. This is one that I really did not understand was so important until a few years ago. Finding meaningful work. And when I say work, I don't necessarily mean job. Although that can be important to find something that you love. But when people were incarcerated in these concentration camps or gulags, people often took on roles. You know, Maximilian Kolbe was hearing confessions. Other people would say, I'm gonna try to forage for food to help my fellow prisoners. There was something they were doing that gave them belonging and significance, even in the most heinous of conditions. I've seen people, I'm sure you have too, who've gone through really terrible situations, human trafficking, etc., and they go on to help other people in similar situations. So it's terrible that they had to go through that. and they can take what they learned to help others. That's one of the most impressive and healing ways of moving past traumatic experiences. I will say another big issue, I think as women in this crowd probably have heard about this, is a real issue with maternal mental health. You know, moms who have their babies and just go right into depression. I've seen that a lot. And a lot of that is they have their babies, but they don't feel belonging. I think you see belonging and significance next to meaningful work. So they need to feel like they're part of a community, you know, that they're helping with a meal train, that they have people to be with, that they can help their friends. So a lot of this is not just job, but it's where do you fit into your community? What can you do? So I think that is that for that part. Oh, actually, I guess a few questions if you're interested in this to jot down. You know, what are you good at? What are you interested in? Get feedback from other people to help figure out what that is. Some people will go, I'm just gonna go get a 9 to 5 and just support my family. That's also good because you're finding, even if you don't care what kind of job you have, but you're doing it for your family, that is meaning and significance, that is belonging. And that is often what helps people get through. Just one more client story. I had a client, we were at a stalemate in therapy, and she was not making any progress and kind of mad at me, and I said, you just need to get a job. She was very offended. She got a job and then she felt better. Because she had something she was doing. People appreciated her. So you can do the best therapy in the world and have the best relationships, but if you have no belonging or meaning in your life, you're not gonna feel better. All right. The last part, and actually this might be the most important part, so pay attention again if you're feeling sleepy. So I have seen a lot of suffering over the years in my work, and one of the most destructive things that people will say to people who are suffering is they'll say, God is testing you. And that can be really tough to hear because God loves us. And it's sort of hard to say God is testing you to someone who's in a concentration camp, or who has lost their child or lost their spouse. God is allowing us to suffer. He's not up there trying to orchestrate our suffering. He's allowing this to happen, and he can definitely work through it. But people will drive themselves crazy trying to figure out, why is God allowing this? And sometimes we know this side of heaven, we can see the meaning, but sometimes we don't. And so if we're constantly focused on what is the meaning here, why is God letting this happen, we're not gonna heal often. Just accepting the situation and accepting that God loves us and will be there for us even if we don't understand. It's really important. So I think I've just ran through this really fast. So that means we have lots of time for Q&A. Are there any questions about the suffering part? Yeah.
How do you know if something is actually a traumatic thing that's happened to you, or if you're just making it up for attention, pity, etc.?
Oh, I really like that. So something that's traumatic for one person might not be traumatic for another. It really does matter how it hits you. So a great example of this is perhaps a child who's, I see this a lot, a child whose parents divorced when they're in elementary school. I mean, a divorce is objectively traumatic. A kid at the egocentric stage of development might say, oh, it's my fault. There's something I could have done to stop my parents from divorcing, which we know is not true, but it feels true to that kid at that age. Whereas an older person, maybe a teen or young adult, it's still very traumatic, but they are able to say, okay, this is my parents' issue. It's not my fault. And so it actually hits them differently. So it is true that something can be harder for some people and not as hard for others. Does that make sense? It really matters, depends how it hits you. And obviously, I will say, if you are in fear for your life, or if you are in fear for the life of someone who is close to you, that is considered like one of the criteria for PTSD. Because there are so many traumatic things, but fear for your life and fear for the life of someone you love. I will say, we're realizing more and more that difficult breakups or divorces, even if you're not fearful for your life, people have a lot of PTSD symptoms from that sometimes, because you're having your relationship,
your relationship with your attachment figure threatened, and that is sometimes more important than food, water, shelter. Having someone is the most important thing. Yeah, any other questions? Yeah.
What if the feeling just doesn't hit you at all? Like you just like completely like push it by?
Yeah, so that can be very adaptive. Some people will say, is there something wrong with me? And I'll say, no, that can be adaptive. If, somebody, I'm trying to think of something that's scary but not super realistic. Okay, so if a lion comes running in here, I hope none of us stop and say, oh, we're so scared, let's feel our feelings. We need to get out of the threat. But what happens is sometimes people will stay in that frozen emotional state where they don't feel anything, even when it's safe to feel. And everyone's different. I tend to be a number, so I don't feel right away. It kind of comes out slowly. But what I recommend for people in that situation is taking a few minutes every day to check in with yourself. When I think about this thing that happened, how do I feel? But allowing yourself to notice those feelings for a few minutes. But you don't have to do that all the time. It's okay to actually put our negative feelings away and focus on something else. But just checking in with yourself and allowing yourself to feel them might loosen some of them up and might help you process them. Does that make sense? Yeah. I had other questions too. Yeah.
How would you recommend like practicing acceptance?
Okay, so going back to there's the intellectual and the emotional, right? So if you are able to say, I've gone through this, there's nothing else I can do to change the situation, I'm gonna try to accept it. And I'll often say, what's stronger, the part of you that wants to accept or the part of you that doesn't? And you can kind of figure out your progress by noticing that. What's stronger in me, the part that wants to accept or the part that doesn't? It's really helpful. Oh, there's a camera here. It's really helpful to talk through this stuff with a friend or a therapist. It's very different to kind of heal by yourself. You might not catch everything, but if you're talking through it with someone, that can help too. Does that make sense? Yeah, I have other questions too. Who else? Yeah.
So you talked earlier about like having like numbness to negative emotions.
Mm-hmm.
If someone has like a numbness to positive emotions, what would that mean? And is there a way to like change that?
Yeah, so I do want to normalize. Some people are just more phlegmatic, more laid back. They don't have as strong emotions. I've noticed often people who have gone through adversity or trauma, we numb our feelings, so we can't feel anything. So that's a big issue as well. So being able to check in with yourself, what am I feeling right now? What are my thoughts? What am I feeling in my body? I know it sounds corny, but just being able to do that can help you gain some self-awareness. And it can also help you notice your feelings, and when you're noticing them more, they're not stuffed down and suppressed. They're not as numb. Does that make sense? Yeah.
How would you suggest like being able to see someone that's not actually capable of doing something and not see it as like a form of laziness or
Yeah.
like just understand that the person's not actually capable of doing something even though it looks like or you believe that they should be able to do something?
That's a really good question. So unfortunately, if it's somebody else, it's hard to know for sure. Only God knows. I don't think that saying I've gone through adversity, I have mental health issues, I don't think that should be a get out of jail free card. I guess we're talking about jail a lot, but I'm using this, in the turn of phrase way. So if someone is making progress is what I look at. So if someone is waking up at 11 instead of 12, okay, maybe they're trying. But if someone is doing the same thing and seems very stuck, I think it can be appropriate to challenge that a bit, because you're not gonna heal if you stay stuck. But if you're making little changes to better your situation, that's actually most helpful. So I've worked with parents and with adults, with parents of adult kids and parents of kids, and I will tell them, your kid is going through a hard time, you can't let everything fly out the window. There has to be some expectation or they're never gonna heal. They need to have something to focus on. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course.
So, let me think exactly what I wanted to say. So, ignoring their problems, like a friend,
Mm-hmm.
just kind of ignoring it, how should you approach that where they don't just kind of brush it off? Because I've experienced that somewhat, where
Mhm.
someone might just be like, I'm like, I think it might be this, and they'll say, no, that's just the way I am, or something like that.
Yeah, and that's tough because part of this comes back to, so you're doing the first thing where you're trying to help others, focus on relationships. Sometimes other people aren't interested, and so we have to practice acceptance. The other person's on their own journey. You don't need to enable that though. If someone is consistently hurting you, you can set boundaries. Yeah, that's actually good for them. If they see, oh, I can't get away with being late every single time, they're actually gonna leave without me. That might be good for them.
What if someone's kind of hurting themselves in their behavior?
That's a tougher one. Are we talking like they're hurting themselves in their relationships or hurting themselves physically?
I see a lot of guys like this where they're pushing themselves way harder than they should.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I see a lot of guys like that too. And sometimes they gotta learn the hard way. Hopefully it happens before they have some kind of mental breakdown or something. But it's hard to watch. Yeah. You can point it out to them, you can ask questions, and ultimately it's up to them. Yeah. Yes.
How do you tell if you're oversharing or not? You touched on this a little bit.
That is somewhat subjective. Notice different age groups, different cultures. Like y'all share way more than we millennials do. We share more than the Gen Xers do. So it's kind of cultural. So I like when I'm working with little kids, I do this, and actually I do this myself too. There's kind of the world, then there's your acquaintances, then there's your friends, then there's your inner circle. And sometimes people who've gone through trauma, they'll tell their acquaintances or the world things that they don't tell their friends and inner circle. And if you catch yourself doing that, that can be a sign that you gotta do some work. I don't necessarily think you have to share everything with your friends or even with your inner circle, but just make sure that it's balanced, right? And I have seen an uptick in women going, oh, you're trauma dumping, I can't be your friend anymore. And that's terrible. You have to let people know, hey, this is a bit much for me. You don't need to make them feel bad, but if it's too much for you, let them know. And so that's also your friend's responsibility, yeah.
How do you forgive someone when they continue doing the thing that you're trying to forget?
Yeah. So a lot of that is the client that I talked about at the very beginning. She had to start pulling away from a relationship with her mother in this case, which was quite tragic. So her mother wasn't in her inner circle anymore. Her mother became one of her friends. I think at one point her mother became one of her acquaintances, which was really sad. But you might have to put the person in the place that they're supposed to be in based on their behavior. And that doesn't mean being mean. It's tough when they're a family member. You can't just leave the house, but you can kind of do some internal work. You can say, all right, I've decided that this is the way this person is. I can't change them. They probably have their own mental health issues. And when you're able to put it in that perspective, it hurts less. And I mean, that's what a lot of people in these camps would do too. They wouldn't take it personally, which seems unbelievable to me, when guards or others were persecuting them. It's okay, these people are very misled. And it didn't feel as personal, which, yeah. For those, if you're in that situation like that, you need to just leave if you can, but yeah. Any other follow-ups for that? Okay, yeah.
Do you have any tips on forgiving yourself?
Oh my goodness, I'm glad you brought that up. I literally had that in my outline and then I forgot to talk about it. Yeah, forgiving yourself is one of the hardest things ever. And one of the problems with trauma is actually I'm gonna share this story because it's very compelling. So people tell me stuff, because I'm a therapist, so I'll just be going about my everyday business and someone tells me something. So my chiropractor goes, oh yeah, I've been in therapy for X number of years. When I was a teenager, my cousin was drinking and he asked me to drive him somewhere and I said no, and then he drove himself and then he died in a car accident. And so I was like, oh, I can see why you were in therapy for a very long time. And he had to forgive himself. He had to work through, I didn't kill my cousin. Like, I did not want that to happen. It was wrong place, wrong time. And he had to sort of work through this deep-seated belief, it was all my fault, which is on your handout as well. It was not all his fault. So some of it was cognitive. He had to work through that part, I would imagine at least. There is kind of that emotional part, right? You can have all the reasons that it wasn't your fault, and you might still feel ashamed. Now, sometimes it is people's fault. You know, I've worked with women who've had abortions, and they, of course, feel very, very guilty. And the thing about guilt is sometimes guilt tells us that we've done something wrong, and we have to atone for that. If you've already told God you're sorry, if you've already told your unborn child you're sorry, if you've told other people you've hurt you're sorry, if you've gone to confession, you are forgiven. And that's hard to feel often. So we have to sort of work through that in relationships with other people, experiencing forgiveness with other people, working on a relationship with God so we can experience that with God. And there sometimes are just days and times in our life when we know we're forgiven, we know we should forgive ourselves, we want to forgive ourselves, but it's hard to feel that. It's kind of a process. Does that make sense? Any other follow-ups on that? Yeah.
What if you just don't feel guilty, but you know you should feel guilty not doing anything?
Yeah, that's another thing. So that's sort of a protective mechanism that people have. Kind of like they might numb themselves out to feelings so they can't feel guilty when they should feel guilty. So a lot of the work for that is getting back in touch with your feelings, you know, noticing. I will tell clients, you look a little bit tense as you're talking about that. And they go, I am tense? And then they think about it and they go, oh, I am a little bit tense. So you just kind of noticing those feelings. There are clues that you are having a feeling, even if you don't consciously feel it. I think a lot of people have not been formed properly too, so they might not feel guilty when they've actually done something wrong. And that can kind of go back to childhood, parents, teachers, peers. And so sometimes just kind of intellectually knowing I did something wrong, even if I don't feel it, is helpful as well. That's not maybe very satisfying. Any follow-ups on that? Did any more questions? Oh, yeah.
What if you shouldn't be guilty, but you feel like you should be guilty?
Okay, so it's like you haven't done anything morally wrong, yet you still feel that you should feel bad about it. Okay, so we're talking like a friend is mad at you, but you haven't done anything bad to the friend. The friend is being very illogical, but you still feel bad. Is that kind of the idea? Okay. Yeah, so this is really common, especially for women. We want everyone to feel good around us. Lots of men too. And we have to, I guess, sort of acknowledge what you just said. You know, I haven't done anything morally wrong. I've checked it over. This other person has to work through stuff. I can't get through to this other person. I have to accept that this is how he or she feels. And you're not being unloving to the person by feeling unrepentant for something you didn't do. You're actually maybe sending a good message to that person. I'm trying to think. I'm not sorry for calling 911 when I thought you had alcohol poisoning. Like, that was a good thing to do. I know you're mad at me, but that was a good thing to do. This has happened to people. And it might be good for the person to see that this is not something objectively wrong that has been done to them. That was kind of a long-winded answer. I don't know if that makes sense. Any follow-ups on that? Yeah.
What if you numbed your emotion down enough to the point where it's not just affecting your emotion and you can't feel sympathy according to others?
Yeah, this happens to a lot of people who've been through trauma. It's like vicarious, so it's compassion fatigue. You just can't feel anything for other people. So normally, the first thing we do for that is we say, okay, it's time for a change of environment. I mean, this is actually one situation where I would recommend people get a change of environment if possible, because you need to heal and rest in order to feel that empathy again for people. A lot of therapists will take a leave of absence because of this. So it can also be helpful to remind yourself, I intellectually know that this person is suffering. Even if I don't feel it, it doesn't mean I don't care for them. I don't feel that feeling, but I do care for them. So there's kind of that intellectual piece as well. Does that make sense? Okay, yeah.
What if someone is in a new environment and they still are struggling with empathy?
Okay, so some people, I want to be careful here because some people, their strength is empathy, and some people, their strength is getting stuff done. That's not really their strength. If someone wants to develop the skill of empathy, a lot of that is practice. We practice with little children. We'll say, oh, this person, how does this person look? What do you think this person is feeling? So we can do that for ourselves. When we're in a situation where we're having trouble relating to or empathizing with someone, we can ask ourselves, how do I think this person is feeling? How would I feel in that situation? So a lot of self-talk might help, but it's just not going to come as naturally to some people, and that's totally fine. Any questions? Does that make sense? Okay. You guys have a lot of intense questions. Yeah.
Do you have any advice on reintegrating after a traumatic event?
On what?
Reintegrating?
So it has to be done slowly. This is why when soldiers come back from being deployed in a combat situation, they reintegrate into life slowly. And part of that is keeping yourself within your window of tolerance. There's this idea that you should push yourself to where you're feeling stressed, but you can't push yourself to where you're having a panic attack, to where you're in a depressed episode, to where you are so numb you can't function. You should be stressed, but not that stressed. So that's kind of the rule of thumb that I use for people who are reintegrating. Maybe you should do part-time work instead of full-time work. That kind of idea.
I meant like reintegrating mentally, not in society.
Oh, okay. It's actually similar. You might, people need to take more time to themselves generally, to have silence and alone time. Other people who are more extroverted might say, I don't need silence and alone time, but I need to do stuff with people where I'm not thinking about what happened. So there's kind of this idea that if something traumatic has happened, you have to think about it and process it all the time, and that's actually can be counterproductive. You think about it sometimes, and then you take a break, and you check in with yourself, and then you take a break. But the idea is you don't want to push yourself so far that you're outside of your window of tolerance, that you're extremely depressed. This is kind of a tricky concept. So actually, if you guys are on Instagram, little shout out to myself here, Alpha Omega Clinic has an Instagram page, and I've pinned the distress tolerance question that I just shared with you. I've pinned it to the top. So if you're curious about the window of tolerance, you can go look at my very succinct, excellent explanation there. Any other questions? Yeah.
What if you have the lack of empathy and the numb emotions, but you can't pinpoint a traumatic experience?
This is really common, actually. So sometimes there's not. It's just sort of build up of different things. Sometimes I've had some clients just say, I know something happened, but I can't remember it. And they'll say, can you help me, do that? And I'll go, no. If your brain is blocking it, there's a reason for it, and it'll come out eventually if there is something there. It'll come out when you feel safe enough to process it. So people get very fixated on why is this happening to me? And I just advise them to be patient, and it will come out eventually. But all you can do is work on your behaviors and work on being healthy. Does that make sense? Yeah.
What's your take on EMDR?
I really like EMDR. It's super weird.
Yeah.
It's really weird. But what happened was I went to Alpha Omega Clinic and I lost a client. I didn't lose a client. She said, I want EMDR. And I said, I don't know how to do this. And this happened to another client. And so I said, okay, if I'm gonna work here, I better learn EMDR. So I did. And I was kind of a skeptic. And then I noticed when I did it with some clients who had been stuck for a while, things were reprocessed. So what people will say is they'll say, I knew that I was lovable. Now I feel that I'm lovable. Just something shifts, basically. Yeah. Oh, you had a question too, sorry.
What's the MDR?
Okay. How much time do we have? So you can look it up. If you Google EMDR, it'll pop up. But the idea, it stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. Yeah, so the idea is you're thinking about something for short bursts of time while remaining fully in the present, and you're getting new insights as you're quickly processing it. It's the eye movement thing. You know, you'll see therapists and people will follow the eyes. It's really weird, but it's very effective. Yeah. I had other hands that I saw. Who else had a hand? Oh, yeah.
Is it wrong to think you're supposed to feel emotions so you would fake it to make other people comfortable?
Oh, no. So it goes back to actually the circle thing, you know? So when you're with your inner circle or with your friends, it makes sense to try to be more authentic. But I can't, you know, I'm here speaking to you. I'm really tired right now, but I wasn't gonna walk up here and be authentic. I had to walk up here and be in my speaker mode. So I'm not lying to you, but I had to turn that on. So there are social situations where you're not lying to try to try to do what we call expected behaviors. And I would say that sometimes after you get into it, you feel good. So I don't feel quite as tired anymore. Sometimes you just have to push yourself a little bit. Does that make sense? Yeah. Let's see. Actually, I would say it's not lying, it's charity. You know, I'm trying to be charitable. I was trying to be charitable by being peppy, by being a good speaker. Yeah, if I was telling you lies up here, that would be lying. Okay, any other questions? Oh my goodness. All right, going once, going twice. Okay, so I have some business cards there, and so one business card is for Alpha Omega Clinic. We do telehealth. They are Northern Virginia prices. So if you work for the church, you should ask if there's any stipends available for Catholic school teachers. We do have some stipends available to help cover the cost of counseling. I also have my business card there too. I have a practice where I see insurance clients as well. Alpha Omega unfortunately can't take insurance. So you can get in touch with me with either of the cards. If you know you want to work with me or you know you want someone else to work with me, grab my blue card. We also have a flyer for Alpha Omega, and you can follow us on Instagram, Alpha Omega Clinic. I post a lot of stuff there. Yeah, I think that's it. Thank you guys so much.